Good afternoon, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history. We have so far covered under the rubric of French Revolution various stages of the revolution, apart from obviously discussing its backdrop, causes and so forth. And this particular discussion is about the post third stage of the revolution. So, just to give you a sense of continuity, we have earlier spoken of the three stages of the revolution from 1789 onwards. The first stage, which was dominated by the moderates, and it was the constitutional stage of the revolution, where it is through the National Assembly that most of the legislative measures are being passed, and the basis of bringing about change is also legislative. This gave way to the second stage of the French Revolution, say from around the middle of 1792, when the Jacobins had come into prominence, placing the moderates. And Jacobins obviously were more radical in their outlook, and the earlier ones, the Girondins, were somewhat more sedate and slow in terms of bringing about these changes. Jacobins had come into prominence in the second stage, aided by the fact that France was at war with the neighboring states, and initially French army had been facing reverses. So, the situation also had called for wartime measures and cessation of liberal human rights and human rights that were bestowed by the Bill of Rights and also the Constitution in the first stage. So, in the second stage, since France was at war with the neighboring states, you had wartime measures and very authoritarian assertion of power through not the National Assembly, but several committees, the most prominent of them being the Committee of Public Safety. It was through the Committee of Public Safety that the executive power or the governance of France was in actual sense being carried out. Say 2 years or so of this arrangement in the name of law of suspects. Several leaders were implicated, even killed, guillotined, to the extent that by the time we reach the middle of 1794, almost the entire battery of French revolutionary leadership is executed. Even Robespierre is guillotined. Now, this had left the National Convention only with moderate leaders. Moreover, the wartime promises of curbing prices, at least of essential commodities, had also not been met with during the second stage. So, there was no justification left for clamping down those wartime measures on French population, and the mood had swung back, and the French army had also started winning wars. So, there was no need for, there was no justification for calling upon people to sacrifice for the cause of defending the newly created republic and so forth. So, from the middle of 1794, we see the third stage of the French Revolution ushering in the form of Thermidorian reaction, and this was the period of the Directory. Now is the period that is 1794, middle of 1794 onwards is the period where the conservatives are back, where the emigres are back, where the priests are back, and it is the well-off, it is the propertied class, particularly those who had recently become propertied and materially prosperous, maybe through wartime profiting and so forth, not the traditional elites. So they are propertied class, but they are not traditionally propertied class. It is the novo-rich, those who had made quick money in quick time. They were lampooned as being ostentatious, as being vulgar. Yet, during this third stage or the directory period, and I am calling it directory period because I spoke to you about it in the earlier lecture, which was about the third stage, because it was now through the directory of 5 men or the board of 5 men who constituted directory that governance was actually carried out. They gave to France yet another constitution in 1795, which somewhat lent some kind of an official approval, of official stamping of the rule of the propertied class. This constitution says that it is upon the security of property that the entire social order rests. So it's a very candid statement of what lay beneath the social order, and therefore the bourgeoisie is the one that is calling the shots in the third stage of the French Revolution during the directory period. However, in the first elections, in the first, I would say, free and fair elections that were held in France as a result of this constitution in the third stage, this was in 1797, a large number of constitutional monarchists were returned as members. Now, this meant that the directory was now facing existential challenge so far as their capacity to govern and being in power is concerned. The challenges are coming from various sides. On the one hand, you have the leftist pressure. Why I call it leftist pressure? Because Babeuf is offering a very radical challenge. Babeuf has started speaking of property redistribution. He is opposed to the representative institutions through which the bourgeois economy actually would have worked. So, this representative bodies like National Assembly, etc., Babeuf opposes them. He calls his people to do away with this system. So, on the one hand, you have the challenge posed by the leftist threat, although it was not that potent, because this kind of politics, radical politics, had discredited itself very recently during the Reign of Terror, that is the second stage of the revolution itself. So, people were very much aware of the pitfalls and normlessness that could accompany this kind of an arrangement. They had seen the excesses of the Reign of Terror. So, leftist threat is one challenge that the directory is facing. On the other hand, you have the polar opposite of the leftist threat, that is the royalists or the monarchists. Obviously, before 1789, they were the ones who constituted the ruling class. They were not taxed. Now, they are the ones who are the targets. They were the ones who were the targets in the second stage of the revolution. Now that the Jacobins are out of the picture, sans-culottes is not that potent a force during this period of time. Therefore, the royalists and monarchists, the emigres, they are coming back to France, and they are also demanding that the monarchy be restored. Now, the Directory has to negotiate with both these challenges, the leftist challenge on the one side and the rightist challenge, that is monarchist challenge, on the other. And then obviously the untamed problem of inflation, that despite stringent measures during the reign of terror through the law of maximum, etc., there was no end to the spiraling prices, particularly of the essential commodities. So that was creating a kind of pressure from lower order in a different way. And then the fourth challenge, and the most immediate and formidable of all the challenges, was the challenge posed by the constitutional monarchists. I just referred to you about the 1797 elections that were held as per 1795 Constitution of France, and it was the first free and fair elections held in Republican France. And incidentally, the representatives who were selected, who were elected, largely were constitutional monarchists. Now, Directory obviously did not want constitutional monarchy as the political arrangement for France. It wanted to perpetuate itself. It could see that constitutional monarchists would perhaps swing the political balance in favor of the older order. So, whatever gains that the French Revolution had made, the newly propertied class, the newly rich, becoming rich class, which constituted the social base of the Directory period, ensured that despite these large numbers of constitutional monarchists in the convention, in the National Convention, they never come to power, and for that they had to take recourse to manipulations. They had to take help of even the army. They had to resort to several coups, and therefore we find that the Directory found Napoleon very dear and apt for this kind of a situation. We will talk about this with reference to the rise of Napoleon. Abbé Sieyès, you would remember, I had referred to Abbé Sieyès when we were talking about the beginning of the French Revolution, and it was he who had almost proclaimed the revolution in the name of the Third Estate. It was Sieyès who had said that today, and I am talking of pre-revolutionary times in 1789, when in his pamphlet he would write, "Today the Third Estate is everything. Others are just a matter of details, just words, because it is the Third Estate that work on fields, that work in factories, that does business and everything." So the entire economy and social segment of France is pervaded by the Third Estate. Abbé Sieyès, 10 years back, or say 7-8 years back, is saying this. And now the things have changed so much that he has to declare for counter-revolution in the name of virtual dictatorship. Now he is almost taking a U-turn and announces during the Directory period that what is required is confidence from below and authority from above. That is what he is prescribing for France. That's the prescription by Abbé Sieyès. And this prescription almost sounds akin to what the counter-revolutionaries were saying, right? So, but you have to make a distinction here that this does not mean restoration of monarchy. You have to have authority from above, but you have to have confidence from below. There should be some kind of a popular leader who can rule over France with fair degree of authority. That was perhaps missing in the Directory period. And the Directory, in order to perpetuate its rule, was looking for such kind of a personality who would fit the bill, who would fit into the frame that was prescribed by CEC for the future of France. Napoleon emerges as the answer to the Directory's prayers. Obviously, Napoleon, serving in the French army over the years, had emerged as a strong, popular leader who was not a king. He did not belong to that higher echelon of social order in France. He came from a very modest nobility family, which was not very well off. And in fact, Napoleon owes his rise in the armed position, in the armed forces, positions and designations to the provision brought about by the revolution itself, that is, making these posts and positions higher up beyond measure, open to people on merit. Earlier, the practice was to sell them. So, sale of offices, had that practice been there even at this point of time, Napoleon could not have risen this high in the hierarchy of armed forces. So, in the personality of Napoleon, we have a strong popular leader. So, there is some kind of a consensus as well. But also true is the fact that he is not from some aristocratic family, or he does not come any close to the imagination of a monarch, right? And that is precisely what the Directory period was trying to search for. Now, why Napoleon had become so popular over the years is because of the string of military victories that French army was registering all through the second and third stages of the revolution, particularly in the second stage of the revolution. Even to the Directory, he had defended them valiantly against the threat to its existence. So, the Directory owed a lot to him, and that is very instrumental in installing or catapulting Napoleon from an armed soldier kind of a person to being the consul of France, the first consul of France. So, in 1793, for example, while the French army recaptured Toulon from the Royalists and British forces, role of Napoleon was very prominent and prominently acknowledged. Napoleon had also been arrested as a terrorist following the fall of Robespierre. As I told you that during the second phase, these arrangements were so weird in the name of law of suspects. Entire leadership itself was gobbled up, and be it Robespierre, Danton, so forth, Marat, they were all suspected of treason and perhaps not being patriotic enough and so forth, and they were killed. And Napoleon was not immune from it either. He was also arrested as a terrorist following the fall of Robespierre, and that had also given some bit of sympathy for Napoleon. Subsequently, as you can see, a dietary politician, Viscount Paul Barras, hugely patronized Napoleon, and therefore Napoleon was, as I told you, very dear to the directory arrangement, to the directory politicians, particularly Viscount Paul Barras. He always pushed Napoleon into prominence and was always in favor of catapulting him to higher positions and responsibilities. Then there is this incident, October 4, 1795, that in French terms is also known as 13 Vendémiaire. Obviously, that's the nomenclature of the month and the date. Hence, this 13 Vendémiaire. Here, Napoleon is supposed to have saved the convention from attack by its opponents of the new constitution. As I told you that in 1795, during the third phase, that is the directory phase, France had given to itself yet another constitution. And this constitution was almost like an official stamp for the rule of the propertied class. Obviously, it also had some opponents, and those opponents had almost threatened the very existence of the directory. And Napoleon was very handy for the directory politicians in saving them from this situation. And it is this service of Napoleon that gets recorded as the whiff of grape shot, and it had earned Napoleon a lot of public fame and gratitude, particularly by the directory. Apart from that, there were spectacular victories of French army in Italy, which I have spoken to you earlier about, resulting in Austria's withdrawal from the war. And Austria's withdrawal from the war was important because Austria was the place where most of the emigres had taken refuge. They had gone back there, and they were trying to foment internal disturbance in the name of counter-revolution in France from there. And during the directory period, it is from there, from Austria, that most of them are coming back. Most of these emigres are coming back to France, sensing that the times have become more favorable for them, right? So, getting Austria to withdraw from the war was important, and victories in Italy was consequential in this, and the role of Napoleon was very consequential in this. Napoleon is also supposed to have taken a lot of offensive measures as well that catered to the wounded pride of the Frenchmen. He attacked British colonies in Egypt and the Near East, although this particular effort did not result in any decisive result of win or loss for either of the two countries. Therefore, Napoleon gets a call from the directory, and he ends up participating in a coup d'etat with Abbé Sieyès, whose desire, whose prescription we have already discussed as to what kind of leadership does he envisage for France at this point of time. And therefore, on November the 9th, 1799, Bonaparte was declared as the temporary consul, and this again gets recorded in the French annals as 18 Brumaire. Again, this has to do with the nomenclature of this month and date of this month. So 18 Brumaire is the instance of Bonaparte being declared as the temporary consul. Obviously, in emerging so powerful and popular and fitting into the frame of what France really needed, Napoleon's personality and upbringing and his career were also very important. For instance, He was the son of a provincial Corsican nobleman and not someone who is very rich and very aristocratic. So his family background is very modest and very subdued kind of thing, and this gelled well with the spirit of the revolution. When leadership was vested in Napoleon, the level of acceptance was more on account of his modest family background. He had attended École Militaire in Paris, which was yet another feather in his cap. He had graduated as an officer and a gentleman in the armed forces, and he could rise beyond the rank of major. This I have already spoken to you about. He owed it all to the revolution. Had it been the pre-revolutionary France, there was no way a person from such a modest family background could have risen above the rank of major in army, because most of the high positions in army were open for sale, the sale of offices. But the revolution had ensured that those higher positions in armed forces also are open to merit, and that's how Napoleon could rise to those higher positions in armed forces. And obviously, so far as the Enlightenment ethos and values are concerned, Napoleon was creative, imaginative, ready to perceive things as new, and all these were very congenial to the ideals and ideas of the Enlightenment, which was obviously the intellectual backdrop of the French Revolution. So this accounts for the rise of Napoleon in France. Thank you.